London, England, 1885. The last ball of the season burned bright, with chandeliers and polished shoes, but Charlotte Fairleigh stood pressed against the wallpaper, her gown a shade too yellow beneath the light. Couples spun past her without notice. She kept her hands folded, the picture of patience, though her eyes betrayed the quiet knowledge that she was invisible in this glittering room. When the air grew too close, she slipped out onto the terrace. Moonlight cooled the night and a forgotten newspaper lay across a wrought iron bench. She sat, smoothed the page and scanned until 5 words caught her like a nail. Snagging fabric, wanted a sensible woman, steady character. She read the small advertisement again. A rancher named Gideon Thorne in a place called Wyoming Territory sought not beauty, not charm, but practicality. The ballroom behind her rang with laughter and promise. Charlotte folded the newsprint square and slipped it into her glove, carrying it as if it were a secret key. Before dawn she wrote her reply by lamplight. She listed what she could offer: clear accounts, frugal housekeeping, sound health. She even enclosed a budget for a household of 5 figures marching across the page like loyal soldiers. There was no plea, no flirtation, only steadiness. Aunt Rosamond found her at breakfast, eyes sharp. "You were out late, dear." Charlotte poured the tea. "The garden was cooler. You must try the blue satin for next week. It makes you look more hopeful." Charlotte folded her napkin, gaze steady on the clock. "I think I will try Liverpool." The spoon stilled in her aunt's hand. "Pardon?" "I've written a letter," Charlotte said, "to a rancher. He asked for a sensible woman by week's end." She had balanced the household ledgers one last time and left a note beneath their cover: "Debt paid in full. Wish me luck." Steam shrouded the Liverpool docks, ropes creaked, gulls wheeled overhead. Charlotte stood with a small trunk and the folded advertisement tucked inside her prayer book. She boarded without ceremony, hat tied firm against the salt wind. The Atlantic was gray and restless the voyage long. Charlotte lent her hands where needed, steadying a seasick child carrying water for a mother. At night she sat on deck, pencils scratching neat figures in her notebook as though numbers themselves were ballast against uncertainty. New York rose with iron smoke, then gave way to rails that ran into endless grass. Through the train window she watched the landscape unfurl, tidy towns giving way to wild horizon, sky so wide it threatened to swallow the earth. When the conductor called Bitter Creek, Charlotte lifted her trunk, her boots striking the platform with calm finality. The prairie wind tugged at her skirts, tasting of iron and dust. A man stepped forward, hat in hand, lines of sun and weather carved into his face. "Miss Fairleigh." "Yes," he swallowed, voice heavy. "I'm Silas Gideon Thorne. Gone. Pneumonia took him 10 days back." Charlotte's fingers tightened on the trunk handle, then released the ribbon at her throat, stirred in the wind. "Thank you for telling me." A pause. "Who is running the ranch?" Silas blinked, unprepared for the question. "Wyatt, Gideon's brother." Charlotte nodded once, then "We should go." She bent for the trunk again. Silas reached to help, surprised at her strength, and together they lifted behind them. The train pulled away in a hiss of steam, leaving Charlotte fairly facing a land that had just erased the promise she came for. She squared her shoulders and rode on into it. The wagon wheels jolted over ruts as Silas guided the team out of town. The platform and telegraph office shrank behind them until they were nothing but specks against the vast horizon. Charlotte sat upright beside him, gloves folded in her lap. The telegram Gideon had once sent her creased soft from weeks of travel. The prairie rolled outward in every direction, a restless sea of grass under a sky too wide to measure. Wind carried dust that stung the eyes and the air tasted faintly of iron. Silas cleared his throat. "We tried to wire London, might be you never got word in time." Charlotte's gaze followed a hawk circling high above the fields. Her jaw set. "I didn't." He nodded, uneasy, expecting tears that did not come. Instead she clutched her shawl tightly around her shoulders as if it were an anchor. Her chest felt hollow, yet some stubborn part of her refused to yield. Gideon's death had struck before she even stepped onto this soil. Mourning him here seemed like mourning a phantom. By mid-afternoon they passed beneath a row of cottonwoods, their leaves rattling in the dry wind. Their fresh earth rose in a narrow mound. A simple wooden cross marked the place, leaning slightly as though already weathered. Charlotte's eyes lingered, her expression unreadable. She whispered a prayer that faltered midway, words failing where numbers never did. The life she had measured toward was already gone. Still she stayed upright. She had crossed an ocean and the ground would not take her easily. Beyond the trees the ranch came into view. The house stood weary and sun-bleached, its roof patched with mismatched boards, fences sagged, wire hanging loose in places. A handful of cows shifted in the corral, their ribs sharp against their hides. The place looked as though it had been mourning too. Silas pulled the team to a stop in the yard. "This is it." A man leaned on the rail across the corral. He was tall, shoulders broad, his hat low against the glare. Grief and labor had carved his face into lines deeper than his ears. His eyes lifted, meeting Charlotte's only briefly before sliding away. "That's Wyatt," Silas said quietly. Charlotte stepped down, boots striking the hard-packed earth. Dust curled around her hem. She lifted one end of her trunk, steady despite the weight. The cabin Wyatt's voice was gravel, other ones near falling down. But it's yours. Charlotte's eyes flicked to the shack, then back to him. She gave a small nod and turned to Silas. Together they carried the trunk across the yard. The door groaned when she pushed it open. Inside the air was stale with dust. A cold stove crouched in the corner, the floor scattered with mouse droppings. Charlotte set her trunk against the wall, drew a long breath and rolled up her sleeves. She fetched water, scrubbed iron until her palms burned, swept until the room rang with the sound of her bristles. By lantern light she took stock of what little food remained: 12 cans of beans, a sack of flour, half-empty coffee nearly gone when Silas left her to rest. Wyatt lingered in the shadows of the yard watching. At last Charlotte straightened from the table, ledger open before her. Her pencil scored a double line beneath the word "Hey, these numbers are worse than I thought," she murmured. Wyatt's jaw tightened. He had expected her to falter. Instead she met the failing sums like an adversary she knew how to fight. She tended the fire, tied her apron a little tighter, and looked across the dark yard where Wyatt still stood. Her voice carried firm and even. "Where do you keep the wire for mending fences?" The wind moved across the grass, and for the first time in many months Wyatt Thorne was left without an answer. Weeks slipped by beneath the wide Wyoming sky, days of labor and silence settling into rhythm. Evening came, one such day as the sun bled down behind the hills. Wyatt Thorne leaned on the corral rail, shoulders squared as if he held the weight of the whole place alone. His brother's grave lay under the cottonwoods, a raw scar against the prairie. Every time his eyes drifted that way something tightened in his chest until it was hard to breathe. Charlotte moved across the yard with sleeves rolled, her hands raw from chores that had already worn through the softness of London. The cabin no longer smelled of dust and mice but of soap and wood. Smoke claimed bit by bit as her own grief for Gideon still stirred, at times quieter now but no less sharp. He had been only a name on paper, a hope written in letters, yet his absence pressed like a weight. She wondered if this stern brother carried the same weight. In silence Wyatt watched her, waiting for the crack he was certain would come, the plea for a ticket east, the sobs, the surrender. Instead she met his gaze with a calm steadiness. "I'll need the ledgers," she said. For a moment Wyatt only stared. He braced for weakness and found resolve instead. His voice came out low, reluctant. "They're on the table." She carried them to her cabin. That night lamplight spilling across the warped wood, dust motes rose around her as she bent over the pages, lips pressed, thin fingers tracing columns of faded ink. Wyatt lingered in the doorway across the yard, arms folded from where he stood. She looked nothing like the London girl he had imagined. No lace, no perfume, only a woman in plain calico with the grit to fight numbers into order. Later, alone on the porch, Wyatt held Gideon's old hat in his hands. The brim was worn soft where his brother's fingers had shaped it. He turned it once, twice, and glanced back at the faint glow of Charlotte's lamp in the cabin window. Her shadow moved steady across the wall, bent to the ledgers. "She's his," he muttered, voice no louder than the wind. The words tasted of iron, heavy as guilt, yet something else edged in unwelcome admiration, respect, the barest flicker of gratitude that she had not broken. By the time the cottonwoods began to yellow and the air carried the bite of autumn, the ranch had learned the measure of Charlotte's steadiness. Morning light spilled pale over the yard. A tin pail waited by the barn door, left there like a test. Charlotte lifted it, set it beneath the restless cow, and worked patiently until milk rang steady against tin. She carried it back across the yard without a word. By noon she had mended a torn harness, the leather stitched neat and oiled smooth. She left it coiled on the porch rail. Silas noticed first, brow lifting. Wyatt noticed too, though he gave no sign beyond a glance at her reddened fingertip. The ranch creaked along on scarcity. 37 cows, 3 breaks in the south fence, beans dwindling from 12 cans to 8. Charlotte kept each figure sharp in her ledger, the stub of her pencil smudging her hand at day's end. After fences and chores she bent over the pages by lantern light, her lips pressed, thin tongue caught in the corner of her mouth with the focus of a schoolgirl. Wyatt lingered in the doorway, arms crossed. The lamplight laid freckles across her face, freckles she had once tried to hide but here made her look burnished alive. Something in him shifted, no sudden blaze but a steady ember. She had buried a man she never met, yet carried on as though her will could drag the ranch upright. That kind of stubbornness stirred a reluctant respect, and with it a stirring he did not want to name. She tapped the page with her pencil. "Salt," she said, 12 cents for every dollar earned on cattle. Bitter Creek storekeeper thinks he can bleed you dry. Wyatt frowned. "That's how it's always been." "Then it's wrong," Charlotte answered simply, "and it stops." For a moment silence stretched, then a calf bawled outside, thin and hungry. Wyatt shifted. "That one stubborn never takes the bottle." Charlotte rose, fetching the pail of milk in the pen. The calf danced away from her reach. She braced herself, trying again. Wyatt leaned on the fence, arms folded. "You could help," she said, breathless. He shook his head, almost smiling. "Looks like you've got the fight near." One at last the calf drank milk dribbling down Charlotte's sleeve. She Laughed despite herself brushing it off. Stubborn as you, she teased. Wyatt's mouth twitched. Then maybe he'll turn out all right. The lantern hissed in its glass when they went back inside. Charlotte bent to the ledger again, her pencil moving in shorelines. Wyatt stood watching, unsettled not by her defiance but by the small warmth her laughter had left in the room. Charlotte too felt an unfamiliar thread tug inside her, the first sense that grief and resolve could live side by side. She had not come for Wyatt, but she found herself measuring his silences as carefully as her sums. The sky darkened like bruised iron and the wind came down from the north with a howl that bent fence posts and split the air. Snow did not fall, it drove sideways, a white wall that swallowed the ground. Charlotte wrestled with the henhouse door, the gale tearing at her apron and slamming her into a fence rail. The breath left her chest in a single burst. For a heartbeat she was lost in the storm's roar, vision filled with nothing but white. Then a figure surged out of the chaos. Wyatt, his coat flapping like dark wings, he caught her under the arms, hauled her close and carried her through the storm. She could feel the hammer of his heartbeat even as the wind screamed in her ears. Inside the stove glowed red. Charlotte sagged near the heat, breath shuddering back into her lungs. Wyatt stamped snow from his boots, eyes never leaving her. She steadied herself, then turned to the open ledger on the table. 32 days of hay left, she said, voice ragged but firm. Maybe 35 if the storm breaks soon. Wyatt did not look at the numbers, he looked at her instead, the lamplight gilding freckles across her face. Gideon would have liked you, he said softly. He'd have called you stubborn as a mule, probably stolen your sums and claimed them as his own. Charlotte met his gaze, a faint smile tugging. Then maybe you should practice laughing yourself so you'll be ready to remember him as he was. The wind shrieked through the chinks in the logs, but in the flicker of light something twitched at the corner of Wyatt's mouth. Not a smile, not yet, but the start of one. When he stepped outside again to check the herd, Charlotte sat alone by the stove. Her hands still trembled from the storm. She pulled a scrap of paper from her trunk and wrote in a small tight hand, Aunt Rosamond, perhaps you were right, perhaps I do not belong here. She stared at the words until they blurred, then folded the page without signing it and slipped it back beneath her prayer book. By the time Wyatt returned, stomping snow from his boots, Charlotte was feeding the fire, her face calm once more. The unsent letter stayed hidden, a secret weight behind her steady eyes. The blizzard broke, leaving the land hushed, and white cattle stood gaunt against the drifts, their hides thin ribs showing sharp. One morning 6 heifers were gone. Wyatt's jaw tightened as he slung a rifle over his shoulder. They took what's ours, we'll ride. Silas pulled on his gloves, already nodding. Charlotte stepped into the yard, flour dust on her hands. Wait, she said. How many? 3, maybe 4, Wyatt answered. Outlaws. Silas shook his head. No trails, clumsy, likely homesteaders desperate from the storm. Charlotte's gaze flicked to the empty flour sack by the door. The choice tightened inside her like a knot. That evening she mixed what flour remained with water and yeast, hands working steadily until by nightfall 8 loaves cooled on the table. She set them on the porch with a note in block letters, take what you need, leave the cows. Wyatt stared at her, incredulous. You'll feed thieves? She met his eyes, steady. Desperate men aren't always thieves, sometimes they're just hungry. 2 days later 3 loaves were gone. In their place lay a scrap of paper. No more. A mile out the missing heifers stood huddled together, returned alive. That afternoon Wyatt rode south with seed potatoes, a side of bacon and a job offer in his saddle bags. He found them, 2 young men and a boy, hollow-eyed in a sod dugout. Work for us, he said, earn your keep. They did. By late winter those same hands were the most reliable on the ranch. When spring finally came, the herd calved strong. 41 young ones wobbled after their mothers, the prairie alive with promise. One evening Charlotte sat at the table tallying, her pencil moved quick, the columns now filled with black instead of fading gray. Wyatt stood in the doorway watching her tongue catch at the corner of her mouth in concentration. Something stirred in him that felt both wrong and inevitable. He swallowed it down. Later when she came out to check the harnesses, Wyatt found himself beside her in the barn, the silence thick with words unspoken. She brushed hay from her sleeve and said lightly, I suppose I should thank you for letting me turn thieves into cowhands. His mouth twitched, or curse you for it. She glanced up and for a moment their eyes met in the dim light, her freckles dusted gold, his face shadowed with a fight he could not name. He turned away too quickly, jaw clenched in his chest. Loyalty to Gideon and this new unwanted pull for Charlotte collided like flint and steel. Spring spread across the prairie, Indian paintbrush burned red along the ridges, larkspur spilled blue at the fence lines, and the wind carried the scent of new grass. Charlotte sat on the cabin porch, a basket of mending at her feet, her needle flashing in the sun. Hoofbeats broke the calm, a cattle baron from the south rode in fine coat snapping, 2 hired men shadowing behind. He dismounted with papers folded in his pocket, eyes sweeping over the yard. Wyatt was was near the barn hand on a halter. Thorn, he said, voice cutting. This place is running on strings. Sell now while I'm still offering coin. His gaze slid to Charlotte, lingered on her plain dress and freckles. London spinster won't keep you above water. Wyatt's shoulders stiffened, but before he could speak Charlotte set her mending aside and met the Baron's stare. I crossed an ocean to stand on this dirt, she said. If he sells me too. The Baron laughed cold. You'll regret it. He swung into the saddle, spitting dust as he rode away. A week later he returned, 2 riders at his back, the folded deed in hand. I've bought the debt you owe the bank, he said. Sign and walk away. Reject and I'll take it through the court's laws on my side. Wyatt stood silent, rage tightening his jaw. Charlotte stepped from the clothesline, ledger under her arm like a shield. We've balanced worse numbers than yours, she said. The Baron leaned down in his saddle. A woman's sums won't hold back the law. Wyatt's answer was quiet, final. Then neither will yours. His rifle leaned in the doorway. He did not touch it, but the line of his face was enough. The Baron hesitated, cursed low, then wheeled his horse and rode off for good. When silence returned, the wind tugged gently at the sheets on the line. Wyatt walked across the grass slower than usual, as though a burden had been lifted from his back. Charlotte stood among the white fabric, her freckles lit gold by the setting sun. He stopped beside her, reached for the clothes pins in her hand and set them carefully in the basket. The sheets swayed, folding them into a small private world. I've been practicing, he said, voice rough. Charlotte tilted her head. Practicing what? Laughing, he admitted, a faint flush at his neck. And this for a moment his eyes flicked toward the cottonwoods where Gideon lay. Loyalty and grief wrestled with the pull inside him. Then he bent, closing the distance, and kissed her, slow, deliberate, as though asking permission with every breath. Charlotte did not pull away. She met him steady, her hand rising to rest against his jaw. The kiss deepened by inches, carrying not fire but certainty, the taste of sun, wind, and the hard ground they had weathered together. When they parted, Wyatt searched her face as if afraid she might vanish. Charlotte's whisper came soft, I never needed pretty, I just needed to be seen. You saw me. Wyatt exhaled, and for the first time in years the sound was almost a laugh. They married at sunrise with the cattle lowing in the meadow. Charlotte wore the same dress she had arrived in. Wyatt had no ring, only his hand steady in hers. The circuit preacher's collar sat crooked, his words brisk. Silas stood as witness, tears streaking through the dust on his face. The young ranch hands fired rifles into the air in ragged salute, startling the calves and drawing laughter from the yard. Life settled into rhythm. The ranch never grew rich, but it endured. Calves wobbled each spring, hay filled the loft in summer, and the stove glowed steady through winter's teeth. Charlotte's ledger remained open on the kitchen table, neat figures filling the columns, pressed flowers softening its COV.